Sound check. We ready. You've tuned in to the A Plus Coaching Corner with yours truly, Carvel Monroe. Here you're going to get VIP coaching that's virtual, interactive, and practical. Listen, I began my life change decades ago, and I'm still pursuing greatness today. I've been involved with mentoring programs since 1999. That's when I won my first award, and I was featured in the Harvard Gazette for volunteering in the Cambridge Public High School. Since then, I've directed multiple mentoring programs on the East Coast. I've owned and operated a decent small business, working with my hands. I have 20 plus years in the marriage game, raising 3 children, and I've supported many others all the way to adulthood. I have taught people facing some tough circumstances, even in the county jail. But today, I am here just for you in the A Plus Coaching Corner. We're in. Welcome back to the A Plus Coaching Corner. I'm your host, Carvel Monroe. This is session number 2 that we're doing in this Student Success Coach series that I put together in this month. Number 1, we started off with talking about, just a little recap real quick, we talked about a reflection point. And today we're going to dive into the second part, which is a professional. Anyhow, so if this is your first time joining us, welcome in. And if you've been here before, welcome back. All right, so it's interesting that today our topic is being, or basically, a professional, and I'm going to walk you through some of that. It's going to be really good. And then what else? Yeah, so as you can imagine, this morning, this being the topic, this morning was a little scrambler. A lot of, a little bit of movement and commuting and so forth. So this ultimately presents a good foundation and provides some storytelling on what it means to be a professional, right? So let's start it off by doing this real quick. What comes to your mind when you think of a professional? What comes to your mind when you think of a professional? Yeah. Let's take a moment and think about that, right? And I'll ask you a couple other follow-up questions. Who do you admire as a professional? Who do you admire as a professional? Just take a moment and think about that. And then to add to that question, maybe, why do you admire that person as a professional? So I start off by saying, what comes to your mind when you think of a professional? What comes to your mind? I'm going to do a little activity that I like to do in a little while, but I wanted to get you thinking about that. What comes to your mind when you think about a professional? Who do you admire as a professional? And why do you admire that person as a professional? All right. So before I begin to go any further, we began this series with this foundational question that I ask 1 year from today, 1 year from now, and you can shorten that duration time if you'd like. Will you be celebrated or just realize that you were tolerated? That was my prompt question, and that's the question we're going to use for the duration of these series, because that's kind of what our working question is. Not necessarily a thesis, or a research per se, but that's the prompt that we want to be able to answer, and we want to be able to answer that in a positive way to say, yes, we will get to a place where where we are celebrated. That's our goal anyhow. We don't want to get to the end of the time frame and realize that, people just kind of put up with us. They just kind of tolerated us, right? For whatever reason, because it does happen in different circles. Now, while this, I've labeled it my student success coach series, remember, we are all learners on different journeys, right? We're at different stages of the journey as well. We are all learners. We're all learning something. So we're all could be students. Although my primary target, I wanted to help those students recognize that wherever you left off last year, use that as a reflection point and do some searching and analysis, basically, and set for yourself some markers and things of that nature to move forward. That's kind of what we went into in the first session. And now we're saying, hey, as a professional, this is essential, right? The aim is to be one who is celebrated. That's our aim. We want to be held in high esteem. We want to be recognized or considered a worthy candidate, And to do so, this is one of the steps, right? Being a professional is essential to being able to achieve those goals. So let's keep this thing moving a little forward. And I'm going to plug my timer up first of all, because we're not going to exceed this time. And again, we are well within our time and we will get there. No big deal. So here's a little game, not really a game, a little activity I like to do when we're going into something new, just to identify some of the key terms, right? I call this a word association. It's not necessarily a whole semantic mapping type thing, but you can treat it as that, right? So in the middle, I have a professional. And I asked you earlier, what comes to mind when you think of a professional, when that word professional comes to mind? What are some of the words you would put in? Now, let me remind you, my session here is free. We kind of move forward, but in the end, I will have some digital downloads that you can get, and you'll be able to get that for a small price, and that helps support what we're doing here. But for now, you can just write this down on a scrap piece of paper of some sort. What are some words would you fill into these blanks, right? That comes to mind as a profession. And if you're watching this on the rerun, you can pause and then just go ahead and jot down some notes and then unpause and fill in. Now take a look at some of the things I have that I fill into this blank. So, and I try to, it just so happens that I have words like dedicated comes to mind, right? Specialize or a specialist, that comes to mind. I have words like serious comes to mind, or you could say intentional, duty. And I added one more at the last moment, trustworthy, right? And so as I work through each one of these, let's just take each one. Let's start from left to right. Dedicated. When I think of a professional, I think of somebody who's dedicated to something. It's like their thing that they do, right? They're dedicated to doing it. They might get up early to do it. They might, get a great deal of knowledge or learning to be able to do it really well. So they're really dedicated to whatever their craft is, so to speak, or whatever their area of focus is. And so that is one key word. Specialize, that ties into that, or specialist, right? It's almost like most professionals have a specific occupation in a sense. They're good in a certain area. They become specialized in that area over time, especially because of that dedication and the effort that they put in. So as we're talking about this, right, and moving forward, it is important for us to kind of get these nuggets down and realize when we say a professional, these things come to mind. Duty, I add in here. Duty. A professional, have the sense of duty. It's what I must do. It's what must be done, right? And one thing to say is a responsibility, but when you say duty, it's almost like the emotions is pulled out of something. I'm going to do something. It's my duty. I don't want to say it's my job, but it's my duty to do this thing. So that's an important piece to kind of consider as a professional. And then seriousness, right? This is just one of my words. You probably come up with some of your own, but professionals are very serious. they take their work seriously. Um, and not trying to say they don't laugh or play. I do, but that dedication and that specialization, all of that, there's a sense of seriousness or a serious approach to it, right? And that's what helps them be a specialist or do things right in excellence. And then lastly, one of the words that I added at the end is trustworthy. When you think of a professional here, for example, if you have the plumber come to your house or your apartment where you live, you call something's going wrong, let's just say with your piping, and you call a professional plumber. Chances are you're calling them because you trust as a professional they know what they're doing and they're going to be able to remedy or fix the problem and it's going to be resolved. So having a trustworthy person is essential. So those are some words that came to my mind as I thought about being a professional, and I wanted to set this tone right away. So we're kind of headed in the same direction. All right. So I didn't create a chart for it, but the definition, you can look it up, just a key term. And it's going to run along these lines. So I like to do the word association for us to begin to think out the box and have a real concrete imagery in our minds when we think of what a professional is. So this is going to help us achieve that goal. This is going to help us answer that foundational question that we talk about, that at the end of our time frame, at the end of the 1 year or the 9 month or the 6 month experience or whatever it is, that we will be held in high esteem because we are very focused. We understand where we came from. That's what we did in the reflection point session last week. And now we're looking at this one and saying, okay, now we're going with this mindset of being a professional, which is some of this and a little bit more. All right. So let's walk through some of this now. And then I'm going to give you at the end, we'll do some very practical things, but let's give you a couple of things to think about as we walk through this session. And so the first thing I want to go into, and we can, let's just go right into here first. The first thing I want to say is you have to apply yourself. If we're going to get this goal that we're talking about, if we're going to be somebody who is celebrated and really held in high esteem and people really have to consider really hard, we have to learn to apply ourselves. Now I have up on my chart here on my screen, you see I have this thing that says intentional. There are two gears. One says intentional and one says natural. And what I want you to imagine is, and I use the symbol here as a gear, because there's two things working. And there should be two things working in your life, in my life, when I'm on the job, when I'm in my classroom, whatever assignment or task I'm given, these two things should be at work. And I want to talk to you something. And again, I'm going to build off my experience last year. I told you about the students who came to me at the end of the year, and they basically asked me to nominate them for a specific award, right? They wanted to be nominated now that we got to the end of the year. And some of them really lost sight of the fact that there would be an opportunity to be given an award or some form of recognition at the end of the year. And we went through that last week. Now, I only say that now because I wanted to point something out. What I've noticed with some of these students, some of them had this natural, that's the top gear that you see there on the right, the higher end. They had this natural ability to do some of the things they do, right? Some of us, we have a natural ability to do something, whatever that thing is, right? We are good at it. We can do it with not as much effort. And I use this as for an example. Some people have a mind that they can read. They can read some text. They can read maybe a book of some sort. And once they read that thing, maybe say one time or they go through it, their brain just holds on to a lot of the information, or not all of it, but they'll hold on to the information, right? And that's, although that skill is learned, some of them just do it more naturally than others, right? And I can give you another example. Let's use an athletic thing. Someone, say a gymnast, or someone who's let's use the gymnast. I won't flip flop all over the place. They might be able to quickly pick up some moves and replicate those moves without much effort. And that could be a thing. So without a lot of studying, without a lot of trial and error, they might get it in a couple tries. It's still more like a natural ability, correct? I feel as if growing up in my family, my father always said we had more of this natural, we could see it and we can do it. So I learned to work with my hands. And one of the earlier things I learned to do was tiling, right? Laying the tile down flat and, buttering, putting the compound, the mud down on the floor or the wall, something like that, and just kind of see it come together. However, there's the natural part of what we do, and that natural gear that's working will only take us so far, right? That's like I'm saying the student who can read the book or read the text, and you can, put that thing down, and next week you do a quiz or a test, and that student will get a pretty decent grade just by the first time they went through it or something like that. That's the natural ability working. Doesn't take a lot of effort. Now, the part that I want to add is for us to excel, we can't just rely on the natural ability alone. We have to do some intentionality. We have to have some intention, mix the two together, get those two gears working, right? This is going to avoid us just not living off the natural or the grace that we have to do the basic, right? And I've seen students, for example, who say, for example, there's a quiz or a test or a report or a project of some sort that needs to be done, and they kind of flow off that natural ability. Well, they can get words together real quickly, or, they can find some images real quickly. They get the basic idea. They can, they can kind of work their way through it pretty seamlessly. And then without having the intentional gear working, though, what can happen is, say, for example, in the test taken or the assessment taken, that student can end up with, say, a 70%, a 75%, or an 80%, right? They can do a fairly good job without studying, without making the extra effort. And that's what I mean. This could separate how you end up in the end. Because keep in mind, especially when you're going after something, you're probably not the only one going after it. Right? You're not the only one learning a skill or a trade, or, you're not the only one. There's other people out there who's learning the same thing and oftentimes going after the same thing you're going after. And so to really stand apart, to set yourself apart and define yourself, it takes more intentionality. You have to do a little bit more than the natural. So I have a cousin that taught me how to wrestle, got me introduced to wrestling when I was in my high school years over the summer. And, you can learn some stuff. And I think I picked up some of the moves pretty easy, others we worked at. However, the people that really excelled in wrestling are the ones who didn't just come to practice and learn the moves or some of the moves and so on. It's the ones who put the extra effort in. They were more intentional. Maybe they went to some camps. Maybe they enrolled themselves into different kind of tournaments or frequent tournaments so that they could keep brushing up on their skills and learning this. There's just a lot more intensity with the intentionality. And so hopefully, without belaboring the point too much, you can get an idea of what I'm saying of you need to be able to mix that natural with being some intentional effort. Those two gears working together will get you on a higher level of success, and it will also get you to outpace or really contend for what you're seeking. You cannot just let the natural work for itself and think that you're going to stand apart or you're going to, it'll set you apart from everybody else, right? There are people who are so dedicated. They're so much of a professional. They take it with a different mindset that when you get to that next level, you'll see that, wait a minute, wow. And so oftentimes, or once in a while, I will use some student samples, for example, and I will show other classes, look at this particular student, right? And look at the work that this student has produced. And I do this because I want them to know other people are going in a little harder, right? Other people are making use of the moment. They're not squandering the time. They're really applying themselves to show more work. And so it's very important, and we can get into this in a week too, but you need to know, first of all, these gears need to be working. So you have to apply yourself. So it's a simple format, not too complicated, but it's very critical. And it doesn't matter where you are. These two things will always seem to work, right? So let's get to the next one. I'm going to give you two of these this week. I initially was going to try to get a third, but I think it does its point. So applying yourself. Let's get to the second one. We're talking about a professional, right? We're talking about a professional. So the first thing is we said to apply yourself. Here's the second one I want you to think of. Two more gears. How's that? I want you to think about the internal and the external, right? The internal and the external. And I had another point I had to add to my apply yourself, but I'll get back to that. Let's think about the internal. I say consider the drive-in conditions, right? And I say the drive-in conditions because there are two things that will drive us sometimes. Our internal discipline and commitment and convictions. That'll be one thing that'll take us where we're going, or will get us on the road, right? That is one thing that we got going for us. But there's a second condition that we need to think about, and that's the external. And hopefully I can do a good job in breaking them down a little bit. Okay. So a lot of us come, obviously we have our internal convictions and our drive, something that makes us get up in the morning. We have some level of ambition. That works for us because it's going to be like our compass oftentimes to go forth and do what I think. But as we learned last week, and as we talked about this thing about the journey that we're on is often a long journey. It's not a sprint that we do. It's usually a longer journey. And that longer journey have a way of wearing us down. It kind of takes our energy sometimes. Somewhere along the way, we tend to forget what we're doing, right? And so it's easy to have those internal convictions and those strength and that drive. But oftentimes that can get worn out in the process, right? It can get worn out. We can get worn down to the point that we're not as solid as we could be. So the external factor tends to kick in, and that could be both a good and a negative. Both of these things have their pluses and their minuses. So, and I'll give you an example of this, right? So let's talk about this. Sometimes it takes a really good balance of the two, right? Because, and I broke it down into some natural things. So internally, you have a certain standards perhaps, and that might take you one direction. But without knowing, you could stop. Here's a great example that I have in mind. If you've ever played a sport before, and I'll talk about wrestling a lot because that helped shape a lot of my life, especially in my high school years. You're working out with the coach sometimes. Say we're doing just those beginning warm-up calisthenics exercises, and it says, hey, all right, everybody drop, give me 20 push-ups, right? And you're doing your 20 push-ups, you're knocking them off, you're doing those push-ups, and everything is cool, and you're counting them out loud, 17, 18, and you get to 18, and it's like, all right, two more, yeah, 19, 20, you get to 20, you're like, yeah, I'm done, kind of, you're thinking, and you hear the coach's voice that says, two more, and you're like, I already did 20, and you're like, all right, 21, 22, and they say, all right, one more. And then it's like, all right, one more. And it's like, one more. And they keep going sometimes to the point of fail. In other words, to the point where your muscle is just so fatigued. You're at 24. And then you're struggling to get 25. And I know that's a small amount of push-ups for some people, but it's just an example. And so the internal drive can take us to one level, but the external drive can help us achieve greater than we believe, right? So there's a positive kind of a force, how external can work with our internal. That's going to be very important for us as we're charting down our next goal. We have to pay attention as well, not just to our internal drive and commitments and what we plan and what we hope, because sometimes we don't set it high enough. We don't think we can do better. And I'll give you another example in a moment, but I do the athletic one right now. So here's a positive example of if we're paying attention and letting both gears work, the external gear work, it can help us to excel. Now, there could be that coach figure who helps you achieve that higher level because he or she knows you could do better. He or she knows you have more of a potential than you allow yourself to produce, right? Because even our best efforts, we could be ambitious, but sometimes we're blindsided. Sometimes we don't know our blind spots. Sometimes we just do even, I won't say the bare minimum, but we do what we feel good about. And some of us have an ability to push ourselves beyond that, but not in all cases, right? And it all depends on the level of maturity that we're at. But if we let the external factor come in, whether we have that positive figure, such as a coach who's willing to say, go a little further. Now, it doesn't have to be a sport. In a student setting inside a classroom, for example, this could be the teacher who, when you submit that project or that assignment or the draft or something like that, typically a teacher will scaffold it and maybe a draft, and they'll say, hey, look, this is good, but perhaps you need to consider this, consider that, right? And what they're saying is, this is looking good so far, or this is pretty good, but you can go a little further, right? This can go a little further. You can make it a little better than it is. And so even in this setting, that's an external factor, I'm going to call it. That teacher is an external who's be able to help you. So when your conscience or where your conviction or where your level of success is limits you, this person can help drive the capacity to say, go a little further, go a little deeper, right? And do something more than you've set out to do. All right. So hopefully you can kind of see these two now. What I mean, these two gears are at work. First, we talked about the first one when we say apply yourself. And we say in this first one here, right, we talked about the natural and being intentional. That's one thing where some natural gifting and ability will bring us so far. But now if you're more intentional, right, that'll help that natural ability go even further. And so now we're saying, hey, consider these two driving conditions. Internally, we're driven to success to one level, right? But there could be some external forces or factors that can help you get to another level. Now, let's do the contrast of this, because if you're setting out to do a goal, if you're setting out to be the best you, there's a negative side to this as well. Sometimes, and I've noticed this, a lot of students fall off because of the external factor. Not the positive ones like the examples I just gave, but more of the negative, right? The more negative factors, like maybe just the people in the environment who don't come with the same internal commitments and internal drive and internal fortitude and internal discipline, right? Right. So sometimes being in that larger environment, the community around us, right, depending on where you are, you have other people who come in who with the just enough mentality or the good enough mentality, or I don't need to go to that level mentality, right? Or just the extreme of people who come in and just don't respect the environment. They don't respect what you're working towards. And they don't, not just you, but everybody in the environment, the classroom, right? The office space. This changes the culture, and it has a lot to do with culture, but it also brings down those intentions, right? You could be somebody who's a high performer, or you have the mentality of a high performer, but you're surrounded by people who don't have that mentality of being a high performer. They're just good enough to get a grade. They're good enough just to know they're passing, right? It's not an F, I'm passing. Oh, I got a C? Yay, I'm good, right? Or if you're on the job, it could be just the people who are there just to get a check, we say, right? They'll do just what it takes. Hey, the boss is not on my head. The boss is not on my shoulder. My supervisor is not nagging me or driving me. So sometimes that's the negative impact of being in the environment, right? Where those external factors can literally hold you back because you're not in a high performing environment. And this could be tough, especially as a student. If you're in one of these harder communities, maybe there's a lot more issues, right? That's at stake, that impacts a learning environment, and it impacts people who are seeking to achieve. So you got to be mindful of that. I've given you a positive version of how the external can be good. It all depends on who you're looking towards. Now, these are just a negative example, and we all have them. Even in your personal space, there are people who don't have your same intensity. It could be in your bloodline, right? In your family. It could be family bonds. It could be friends. They don't have the same commitment and discipline. And sometimes you can motivate them, but the longer you're around that environment, sometimes they will influence you. So there's two different examples I've shown you, right? All right. So let's switch gears one more time. So let's drive down to the next point. And I only gave you two of these this week because I think they sell the point. So Having these gears work for you at the different stages of your journey is going to be good for you. It's simple, I tell you, but it's fact and it's true because we're all there. Okay. And then next week, I'm going to balance out this professional side with the other side because some days it's tough to show up as a professional, right? Some days things happen that get into our way. We'll talk about that on session 3, where we talk about the pits or talk about the pit stop. I don't remember what the title is anymore. I'll look back. But that's what we're going to balance it out as a profession. But let's get a little bit more. And I don't have these on the screen. Kind of just 1, 2, 3. I'm going to give you real quick, but I think you can imagine what I'm talking about. So we talk about the professional in the beginning. And I started off by gave my little word association to help us drive. Instead of just giving you a definition, I like to get words up that I can visualize. A professional, somebody who's a specialist, so they specialize in something. They're kind of duty driven, duty bound, right? They're trustworthy. You know that they have the knowledge or the insight or the skill to deliver on whatever you need. And they're serious. What's up, man? I'll look at comments in a moment. I know I've been off. I haven't really stared at the comments. They're serious about what they're doing and they're very dedicated, right? You need these kinds of, you need this kind of mindset to take to your environment, to take to your school in the fall. You need this to take to you every day on the job, right? Having this kind of mindset is going to help you thrive, right? I've had this encounter no matter where I've worked. I tend to dress a little bit more, which we'll get into this right now, right? I tend to put on a shirt or a button-down shirt regardless of the environment, right? And I've done this for years, even when I worked in an after-school setting and played basketball with the kids, right? Because sometimes, and this gets me into one of the points, and these will not be on your screen. I could type them up real quick, but it's a waste of time. 3 things to go away. Number 1, you got to show up as a professional. Show up as a professional, right? That's the very first thing you must do. So there's my blank screen. You must show up as a professional. It has to do with, part of it is physical appearance. Yeah. Right. But it sets the mindset too. It also reminds you, I think, my opinion, when I dress up, it reminds me of that I have a higher expectation, right? When I wear a shirt and some slacks or something like that, it reminds me that I might be in an environment, but it helps me to bring out my best. And I know your best could be whatever you have. I don't mean that way. If you're clean and you're all good, show up as a professional, right? No matter where you are. One thing is some schooling environments where they have students wear uniforms, it helps to reduce the distractions, right? I know some kids don't like the uniform. It doesn't look as cool, but it reduces the distractions on what I got to wear and, to look good or to fit in. And maybe you don't have all the latest gear, the influence, the money to buy the latest gear, and that could create a problem, right? But if I can show up as a professional in a uniform and everybody's got the same uniform, one less distraction off my mind. So show up as a professional. That's number 1. Number 2, I said you have to engage as a professional. Engage meaning you got to remember why you are where you are. Why are you on the job? Why are you in that classroom? I know the islanders, people who come from the island, I'm pretty sure people here says it too, but I've worked a lot around with people from like Haiti and stuff like that. And they always used to say, my mama says, you don't go to school to make friends. They say something like that. You don't go to school to make friends. They're saying, look, you're there to be a professional. And in that case, you're a professional student. And oftentimes students are not hitting that goal because they forget that their main thing is to be a student. Their main thing, I said it's your main thing if you're going to school, is to be a student. You're not there necessarily to make friends. Friends is almost like an automatic. Just be kind. You'll make a friend. You're not going to be a friend of everyone, but just being kind, people will like you. Be you, people will like you. So you show up as a professional. You engage as a professional. Another way of saying engage into, it's also to that interpersonal relationship. I tell people all the time, and you must learn to do this. If you want to use the term code switch, code switch. In other words, in that environment, you're not trying to be what you are in your neighborhood. You're not trying to be what you are, in the hallway even. In the classroom, code switch. Be professional. Speak professional. Drop some of the lingos or, the verbiage that doesn't really fit the environment, especially if it's profanity or something like that. And similar to if you're an adult in a workspace, I don't bring up some topics around my peers, right? You don't want to go too deep. Keep it on that level. So I show up as a professional. I am dressed for the part. I look like that's the environment I'm in. I'm engaged in others. I'm remembering why I'm there. I'm there to learn. I'm there to achieve a certain project or manifest a certain thing at the end of the day, whatever the deliverable is, right? Right. And then lastly, I want to produce as a professional. So you show up as a professional, you engage as a professional, and you produce. In other words, the quality of work that I'm supposed to produce, it should be like a professional based on where you are. And I say that to say this. I say that to say this. There's my comment. I'll leave you right there. I say that to say this. If you have a certain amount of time to do an assignment, it should reflect the time you were given. If you have resources, it should reflect the resources you were given, right? Too often, and I've used that case in the beginning where you do a draft work and the teacher, for example, will say to you, hey, this is great. Perhaps you should consider this or consider that, right? Well, use your time to go back and revise that work and make it look good. A friend of mine used to say this thing to me. It's good enough for government work. I know he just kind of kid around a lot, but I used to share that comment, right? And it kind of ties, play on that. Sometimes the government only do so much or, that kind of a thing. But my point is we want to be able to produce professional work. And this is also what sets people apart, especially when you're trying to answer this question that we worked with last week, right? Will I be a celebrated, that's the one I was looking for, or will I just be tolerated? That's the kind of foundation question we've been working with. Will you discover, this ties back into my bloopers because it's not spelled right, which we'll get into in a minute. Anyhow, so with that being said, we've covered the grounds for this and we still have a little time to spare. Like I said, I think we typically go through this in 30 minutes. So a quick review and we're done, right? We started off with this idea just saying, hey, what comes to mind when you think of a professional? This was essential. We got to have an image of what a professional is in our mind because that's what you need to be in this coming season. You need to be that as often as you can. I want to say every day, but things will happen that will knock you off your horse. Things will happen that will make you feel less than your best. I've been there. Things will happen that will probably seek to derail you, not necessarily always intentionally, but life happens. Life gets in the way. They say that when you go to college, life gets in the way, right? And so this image of a professional you need to have in your mind and take that with you. And whoever you consider to be a profession, have them in your mind to help them, right? Model yourself off of some people. I could use, just came to my mind real quick, someone like a Dr. Miles Monroe is a very professional, always planned, thorough, knowledgeable, relatable, right? And you can tell the work ethic just by the amount of production that that person produces, all right? So I have somebody in my mind. I'm dressed, I'm showing up, I'm producing, I'm engaging others like a professional. If you can work through this in this coming year, I guarantee you'll have a better ending than you did in the past, right? You'll have a better ending than you did in the last assignment. So that's where I'm going to wrap this segment up real quickly. I wanted to point out a few of the bloopers from our first session. So keep in mind that at the end of this series, I'll have a downloadable digital product for you that you could use probably just to reshape yourself. And I've timed it. So we'll end it in July just as the fall approaches for people who are going to go back to school. Some folks can use that. Parents, maybe you can use that to help shape the understanding and the insight of your child. So a few little bloopers we had last week. On that note, we've had one of my signs here, not that one, but I had this sign up and the YouTube short is corrected. It says, will you be celebrated or discover your were tolerated instead of you were? Anyhow, so that was a little typo. The other thing I mentioned was I talked a little bit about I gave y'all a quote. I considered a blooper. I didn't really give him any credit when I shared the quote that says, watch your words. Well, your words become your thoughts, and your thoughts become your actions, and your actions become your habits, and so on. That was from Lao Tzu. It's how I say it. It's that ancient Chinese philosopher who I believe is tied to Taoism. But that's a pretty spectacular quote. I call it a bloopers because I didn't give him any credit for it. And then the other thing of my bloopers session in the last session, I talked about the actors not winning a Grammy. And it really should have been an Oscar or an Emmys. Emmys, I think, is for like daytime TV. But it should have been an Oscar. Anyhow, that's one of the bloopers I did. If you can find any bloopers that I do in this one, hey, let me know next time. And that'll be extra credit for you. How do you like that? All right. So I think with that being said, we've kind of covered the must on an introductory level. There's things that you can do to kind of determine, are you being intentional, right? Here's a little homework activity that you can begin to do. You can begin by auditing yourself, right? We talked about this one, about being intentional. Sometimes you can tell how intentional you are. Audit yourself and see how much and where you spend your time, where and how much of your time you spend doing what, right? So you can take a list of some sort and just kind of write it down, right? That kind of tells, right? You can do this in a year too, in a school year. How much time are you spending on assignments, on homework, on whatever the project is? So you can audit yourself and see where your time is going. And now look at that extra time. You do need a little extra time. In this day and age, they talk about mental health. All right, you do need some of that time to be able to shape your thinking and get a little time to refresh and recover, rejuvenate. That is important. But if too much time is going into just leisurely activities and not enough, then that's probably an indicator you're not as intentional as you think you are or need to be. You're probably just flowing off the fumes or of those natural abilities, right? Which is fine, but it only gets you so far. It only takes you to a certain level. It might give you a passing grade, for example, but you might not get an ace you might not ace whatever it is you're looking to do. All right. So I'm done with that right there for today. I think there's anything else I wanted to cover. I'm good and I'm done. So with that being said, get out of here. Go do something. And I'll see you on the next session. Session 3, pit stops is what I call it. Pit stops. That's going to help balance out the other side of this thing that I call being a professional. Because some days you're not going to feel like a professional. It happens. It happens to the best of us. So join me for that. See you next week.